Richard Richardson Baskin was born on the 17th of August, 1920, in Bishopville, South Carolina. He was the fourth child and fourth son of John Sewanee and Mary Richardson Briggs Baskin. Although he was present in this 1920 census listing, only his mother knew this for sure, as she was just a couple of months pregnant, and her son would not be born for another 208 days from the day this census was taken in January of 1920. At the time of his birth, only one of Dick's four grandparents was still living, his beloved maternal grandmother, Anne Sinclair Richardson Briggs. Dick's middle name, Richardson, was given in honor of this part of his heritage, the Richardsons being a grand and well-known family whose connections to the state of South Carolina go all the way back to colonial times. Dick's grandmother remained an important part of his family until her death in 1934. John and Mary Baskin and family would make that drive from Bishopville to Somerton many, many times during his childhood. There, they'd have large family gatherings with their Briggs cousins. This well-loved photo comes from one of those get-togethers in about 1926. The photo shows all 8 Baskin and Rickenbacker first cousin boys. Although there were at least 3 more Baskin and Rickenbacker girl cousins who would have been there when that photo was taken, they were obviously not invited to join this serious bunch of tie-wearing, barefoot boys. The Rickenbacker boys are sons of Dick's mother's sister, Noddy Briggs Rickenbacker, and 2 of the boys in this photo would be killed during World War II. Dibble in a military plane crash in 1943, and Turi, a Silver Star recipient, during combat operations in Belgium in February of 1945. In April of 1930, the family is renting a house on Lee Street in Bishopville, and Dick's father is working as a highway construction foreman. All 6 Baskin children have now been born, and all are in school except 2.5-year-old Norval. Not all of Dick's trips to visit cousins involved a drive to Somerton. Sometimes his Briggs cousins made the trip up to Bishopville. In this photo taken in about 1935, we see Dick and his sister Norval, along with their first cousins who were children of Mary Baskin's other sister, Ruth Spain Briggs, who was 8 years younger than Mary. Ruth married her first cousin, once removed, James Richardson or Turi Briggs. Obviously, they didn't want to lose that family name. Perhaps due to the difference in ages between Dick and his older brothers, or perhaps simply because of the size of his heart, Dick developed a very close relationship with his baby sister Norval, whom he often called Pink. It would prove to be a cherished and special relationship that would last their entire lives. Buoyed by hard Scrabble work ethic and strong family bonds, the Baskin family continued to work hard and make ends meet, despite the still ongoing Great Depression. As if that weren't bad enough, suddenly the family faced another much more challenging crisis. Dick's 50-year-old father suffered a heart attack and was taken to the hospital in Columbia. A few days later, on the 4th of April 1935, Dick's father, John Sewanee Baskin Sr., died. But life must go on, and it did. Following in the footsteps of his older brothers, Dick started off on his college years, a member of Clemson College's class of 1942. Egged on by his mother and those trailblazing older brothers, he began his undergraduate studies in dairy science. So began a whirlwind 4 years of study, and occasionally hazing. Hey, that's what's supposed to happen to goats, as Clemson freshmen were called. Hazing that might appear a little excessive to today's, dare we say, more tender college students. By the time of the 1940 census, we can see that Dick's 46-year-old mother is now the widowed head of household, living on their farm in Bishopville. We also see that his 2 oldest brothers were no longer living at home. Brother Jack, now 26, had joined the Navy in 1931, started studying at Clemson in 35, graduated 6 months early in 39, worked for the Clemson Extension Service, joined the U.S. Army, married, and by April of 1940 was living on Georgia's Atlantic coast at Fort Trevin. His 24-year-old brother Ed had graduated from Clemson, was still single, and was working in Florence as an assistant county agent. 23-year-old Tom was working as a filing clerk at a bank in Bishopville, a job that paid $600 for the entire year of 1939. Sister Ann was a high school senior, and 12-year-old Pink, well, she was struggling her way through 7th grade. In other words, all things considered, life was pretty good for the Baskin family, and by the first part of 1941, Mary Baskin welcomed her first granddaughter, Frances, into the Baskin fold. Yes, life was good, except for one thing.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Within 3 months of the attack on Pearl Harbor, on the 6th of April 1942, Dick left Clemson and traveled to Fort Jackson in Columbia where, like so many of his Clemson classmates, he volunteered to serve his country's military, in Dick's case, the United States Army Air Forces. From that date, Dick went through several years of stateside service. We're not sure the exact dates of his initial training as an aviation cadet, but we know that by February of 1943, he was in Waco Air Training Base in Texas, and that at some point, like so many others in those days, didn't pass one of his pilot check rides and was eliminated from flying school. Pilot and aircrew training during World War II was tough. Of 317,000 aviation cadets who entered the program, only 193,000 emerged from the advanced course. That equates to an almost 40% attrition rate. But that failed check ride didn't stop Dick Baskin. He transferred yet again and completed all the rigorous requirements to qualify as a radio operator, mechanic, and gunner in the B-17 bomber. Although World War II was a truly global conflict, in this video we're focusing on Dick's part of that war, the European theater. By the time the U.S. entered the war in December of 1941, the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy, had conquered great swaths of territory throughout the world. Almost all of Europe and North Africa was controlled by the Nazis. The United States was not well prepared for this war, and our first combat action in World War II went anything but smoothly. Our British allies had been fighting in North Africa since June of 1940. The U.S. joined the fight there in November of 1942 with Operation Torch. In the movies, our fight in North Africa lasts about as long as the 2-hour film. In real life, however, it was a long, hard slog that took more than 2 years at a heavy cost. By the summer of 1943, after many months of vicious desert fighting, the Allies had forced all German and Italian enemy out of North Africa, including the famed Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. In July of 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. Next was mainland Italy, with landings at Salerno in September and Anzio Beach in January of 1944. The Allies continued fighting northward for the next year. 2 days before the D-Day invasion, on June 4, 1944, the Axis powers abandoned the city of Rome. While most of us have heard of the now famous 8th Air Force, which operated out of bases in England, the 15th Air Force got its first taste of battle in North Africa. While the more well-known 8th Air Force was attacking Northern Europe from their bases in England, the 15th Air Force supported operations in the Mediterranean theater of operations, staging out of North Africa from November 1943 until they moved to Bari, Italy in December of 1943. Each and every day since he enlisted in 1942, Dick and his fellow airmen followed what was going on overseas in the war. They certainly knew that they were entering an exceedingly dangerous specialty, heavy bomber aircrew. War is dangerous business, but war for a U.S. Army Air Force bomber crew was one of the most dangerous jobs in the military. From 1942 to the end of the war in 1945, the U.S. lost an average of 220 servicemen and 170 planes per day. Almost half of those losses occurred not in combat, but in accidents. From December 1941 to August of 1945, there were more than 52,000 aviation accidents, over 6,000 of those fatal. If air crews were lucky enough to survive their stateside training, they then had to survive in the skies over combat areas across the globe, and that survival was especially difficult for our heavy bomber crews. Let's look at just the European theater, the storied 8th Air Force. Operating out of England to hit targets throughout Europe, they carried out extremely dangerous daylight bombing missions. This chart shows the results from 1943, while Dick was still in stateside training. You can see that the lowest attrition rate for the 8th Air Force heavy bombers, which was the B-17 and B-24, was in March. 23 heavy bombers were lost. That's 12%. In the worst month, October, the losses reached a staggering 198 bombers, or 26% of the deployed total. As incredible as those numbers are, the next chart puts things in even more stark terms, human terms. Looking at those same 2 months of March and October, we see a range from 17 to 179 air crews, 19.5 to a mind-boggling and completely unsustainable 37.4% attrition rate. But it's even worse. A heavy bomber air crew consists of 10 air crew members. That's 170 young men in March and 1,790 in October. A large percentage of those terrible numbers for October of 1943 can be attributed to one single mission on the 14th of October 1943. The target, Schweinfurt, Germany. Of 291 8th Air Force B-17 bombers that took off that morning from their bases in the United Kingdom, 60, or 26%, were lost outright. 17 landed but were so heavily damaged that they were written off as scrap. 121 had battle damage to some extent. Of the 2,900 crew who took off on that mission that day, 650, or 22%, were lost. That's one day, one mission, in one theater, against one target. Sometimes it's hard to wrap your heads around those numbers, but in this case, that's one mission that led to 650 of those dreaded Western Union telegrams. 650 more gold stars hung by grieving parents in windows throughout the United States. Dick knew the odds, and all his fellow bomber air crews knew the odds too. They went anyway. That's what heroes do. By the time Dick left for Italy in January of 1945, the 15th Air Force was a component of the Mediterranean Allied Strategic Air Forces and included the Royal Air Force 205 Group and the 5th Bombardment Wing of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Dick's squadron, the 348th, was part of the 99th Bomb Group. During the war, you could usually tell which unit a B-17 came from by looking at its tail. All 5th Bomb Wing planes used the letter Y, and subordinate bomb groups added an identifying shape. Dick's 99th Bomb Group, for example, enclosed their Y with a diamond, and for this reason were known as the Diamondbacks. Finally, individual squadrons could be identified by a Roman numeral. Dick's 348th, for example, was the 3rd Squadron in his group. Tortorella Air Base is located in southern Italy, between the Adriatic coast and the city of Foggia. The base was shared between units of the RAF's 205 Group on the east side of the field and Dick's 99th Bomb Group on the west. These Allied flyers weren't just divided on opposite sides of the airfield. They were also divided on opposite sides of the clock. The Brits flying night missions in their Wellington bombers, and the Americans flying B-17s during the day. Dick arrived in Italy on the 15th of January 1945. Despite the fact that Tortorella and the other surrounding bases had been in operation since December of 1943, living conditions were still pretty Spartan. Everyone slept, or tried to sleep, on bunks stuffed into tents scattered around the base's periphery. And when the mud didn't make life miserable, it dried out and turned into a fine dust, which also made life miserable. The Brits were sometimes jealous of the Yanks' more luxurious living quarters, and especially their chow. One RAF airman talked about enjoying the occasional shared meal at the Yanks' silk parachute-adorned dining facility. One can imagine the times the crews, divided by a common language, swapped stories of daring do and their loved ones back home. We're not yet sure how many missions Dick flew out of Tortorella, but the fact that he was awarded 2 air medals indicates that he flew at least 10 combat missions before VE, or Victory in Europe Day, on May 8, 1945. We may never learn the details of Dick's combat experiences. Like many veterans, he did not often share his wartime memories with others. Perhaps the best record of what his typical mission day was like is found in a letter he wrote to his sister Pink in March of 1945. In that letter, Dick outlines, in his typically understated way, what appears to be his first mission. One thing we do know is that our Dick Baskin was a hero, and we salute him and his brothers, and the family who stayed home and supported them.